How many of you are Golden State Warrior fans? Basketball, all right. Stephen Curry. He goes to the free throw line, and listen, 9 out of 10 times, he makes it. 9 out of 10 times. Now, he's also a 43% three-point shooter. So that means behind the arc, way back, 43% of the time that he shoots, he's going to make it. If you've ever watched some of his highlight films, you know, man, he just throws up some crazy stuff. And you're like, that's not going in, and just, whew. It's amazing. He averages 27 points a game. And this guy is so good, he wants the ball in his hands. When the game is on the line, when you need somebody to come through, you want someone to get fouled, who do you want on the line? You want Stephen Curry on the line. Who do you want to have the ball? You want him to have the ball. And here's something that we don't always realize is we as fans, as people who watch the game, what we see is we just see the game. So in that sense, we only see 90% of what goes on, let's say, in Stephen Curry's life. It's kind of like a lot like character. Think of an iceberg. An iceberg exists, and we only see 10% of an iceberg. Iceberg, there it is. Only 10% is above the surface. That means 90% of that iceberg lies below the surface, and it's what we don't see. So think about that. That's what character is. Character is what lies below the surface. It's what others don't always see. It's what comes out in our public life is directly related to what goes on in our private life. Stephen Curry, at a minimum, shoots 250 baskets a day. A minimum. Over 2,000 a week. And before every game, he's out there 100 shots before every game. And so you might say, Stephen Curry, man, this guy is amazing. He's talented. Yes, he is talented. But he's talented to a point. His talent will only take him so well or so far. What we don't always see is that 90% of what happens during practice on his own, when he's out there shooting shot after shot after shot after shot, Stephen Curry is good because he practices. He has confidence because of what happens in practice. He gets out there and just makes basket after basket, and it's that confidence that carries over into game day and what we see. But his confidence comes from what he practices. Now, if you think about confidence, confidence can be defined as what is said to be firmly trusting, or I can describe it as firm trust. Now, what if I were to ask you this? What if I were to ask you, if there was a way that you could develop confidence in your relationship with God, would you be willing to do something about it? I think we would. This is what this next series is going to be about, developing confidence in our life with God. For us to be able to have this sense of confidence. And one of the images that comes to mind is, I think of this often, but you think of Jesus, and they're on the Sea of Galilee, I believe, and there's a huge storm. The disciples are out fishing, and now they're about ready to be overtaken by the storm. They're living in fear. Man, they're convinced that they're about ready to die, and they go to find Jesus, and Jesus is sleeping on the boat. It's like not a care in the world. We're about ready to die, and Jesus, what are you doing? You're sleeping. This doesn't make sense. How can this be? To me, that's an image or an idea or a picture of confidence. This idea that things can be falling apart, caving in. Relationships could be all unraveling. In the midst of that, we have this innate ability to be at peace, this innate sense that I can trust God in this moment, right now, right here. Confidence. Where does that confidence come from? The other thought I had was of Jesus as he walks into the Garden of Gethsemane. He knows what lies on the other side of this most agonizing moment in his life. He knew what was coming. See, some of us want to know what's coming, but we're not prepared for what's coming. Jesus was both prepared and aware of what was coming. He knew Golgotha awaited him. He knew that this road of suffering, of being rejected and beaten and spit on, that this was a part of what was ahead for him, and yet he walked into that courageously, with courage. And Hebrews 12:2 says, who for the joy set before him, he did it with joy. So think of an image of confidence. He had this confidence in the Father's plan for him. And sometimes we forget that Jesus had to trust in the plan with his limited thinking mind, just like you and I. Yes, he was completely divine, completely man, but at the same time, completely divine, but at the same time, completely man. And so in that sense, he had to depend upon his limited scope and perspective and understanding, just like a man, just like you and I. He had to depend upon the Holy Spirit. He knew what was ahead, but yet he had to have this complete trust, confidence. This is the kind of life that I hope to lead. This is the kind of life that as a church where we're committed to developing devoted followers, that we would hope that you would be able to live for your life, to have confidence that even though you can't see completely up ahead, even though things may be, crashing around you, that you have this sense of peace, this sense of, yes, God is close, he's near, he's for me. And things may not turn out the way I hope them to be or want them to be, but he is for me. He's got a plan, and to be able to trust in that plan. Confidence. God, you have the power to deliver me, but even if you don't, I'm your bondservant. I'm your slave. I belong to you. Confidence. Do you long for that kind of relationship? And yet there's another dimension or side of this series that will be coming out in the upcoming weeks, and that's the dimension of transformation. So there's a sense of confidence that you and I can have in a relationship with God, and then there's also this other dimension, this reality of transformation. And I've been bothered. I've been bothered by this nagging question in my mind over the last couple days, and it's nagged at my heart throughout the course of my time as a pastor, and it's just this question. And there are those who say that people do not change. Right? The cynic says that you and I, we cannot change, and that question really bothers me. Are you and I, are we really capable of changing? Or as humans, as people, is it always going to be a mess? Is it always going to be a certain way? I don't know, does that question bother you? There's the cynic who says, no, humans cannot change, and yet there's this optimistic side and this other reality of transformation that we're invited into where, yes, we can experience transformation, but it's transformation of the heart, and it takes place internally. When I thought of that, I thought of, if you guys are aware of Phil Collins, grew up with, when he was part of the Genesis band, he had this song, and there were words that, here's the words I thought to with that, just that idea of can we really change? And it was the words, always the same, that's just a shame, that's all. And I believe he's probably talking about some relationship with a gal or something else, but think about that, just that reality, can we change? And always the same, that's a shame, that's all. If that's our perspective, if that's what this is, then what are we doing? What am I doing? Come on. Open your Bibles, if you would, to the book of Matthew. Matthew chapter 16. Jesus has been with his disciples now for some time, and they've been around him, they've watched him, and starting in verse 13, we'll read there, and then read to verse 26. So follow me if you would. It says, when Jesus came into the region of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, saying, who do men say that I am? So they said, some say John the Baptist, some Elijah, and others Jeremiah or one of the prophets. And he said to them, but who do you say that I am? So he takes it from what are others saying to what are you saying? What do you think? Who do you think that I am? Makes it personal in that sense. And Simon Peter answered and said, you are the Christ, you are the Son of the living God. And Jesus answered and said to him, Simon, blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, For the flesh and blood have not received this, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. And I also say to you that on you, Peter, on this rock, I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not prevail against it. And I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. Then he commanded his disciples that they should tell no one that he was Jesus the Christ. From that time on, Jesus began to show to his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things from the elders. So he begins to reveal what's up ahead, and the chief priests and scribes, that he was going to be killed and that he would rise again 3 days later. Then Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him, saying, "Far be it from you, Lord. This shall not happen to you." But he turned and said to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan, for you are an offense to me, for you are not mindful of the things of God, but the things of men." Then Jesus said to his disciples, "If anyone comes to me, desires to come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever desires to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will find it." What we just read here is a mixed bag of emotions. I don't know if you sensed it, but we sense this mountaintop. How many of you have had a mountaintop experience with God? You're like, man, this is just like amazing when you experience the provision of God, the voice of God, something comes alive in you and you're like, man, this is a mountaintop. I don't want to leave this place. That was Peter. He's on this mountaintop experience. Jesus comes to him and says, "Who do you say that I am?" And he says, "You are the Christ." In other words, he's saying, I get it. You are him. You are Messiah. You are the Son of God. You are the Son of the living God. And so in that sense, he had this revelation, and Jesus said, and upon this revelation of who I am in your life, I will build my church. And what has he been building this church on? He's been building this church on the revelation of who Jesus is. We are here today, hopefully, because we have a desire or we're in process to know who Jesus is. And God is building his church on that revelation, the revelation of who Jesus is, that he is the Son of God, and that he came to save the world, to be in relationship with humanity. And so Peter is in this place, and he's like on this mountaintop experience, and he's like, yes, I've been affirmed by Jesus. It's like, blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah. You got it right. And it's like, I just imagine Peter, because Peter was this guy that liked to get it right. And he's, thought of himself, as someone who, could do things and be somebody. And so here's Simon, and he's on this mountaintop. And then we come and we experience the other side of emotion. And what's the other side of emotion? It's this valley experience. It's this low point in his life. He goes from a high point to a low point. He goes from having revelation to having no idea how to live out that revelation. And that brings me to this point where, you and I, we can have revelation of who Jesus is. And it's one thing to have revelation, but it's a completely other thing, additional thing, to know how to live out that revelation. To how to live out and be purposeful and mindful of the things of God. And it's there that Jesus said, Peter, get behind me, Satan. You're serving as an obstacle right now to what I'm going to fulfill, what I'm going to accomplish. And it's like you and I, we're invited to this place of relationship where we have revelation, but then what are we going to do with that revelation? How are we going to live it out? What's that space? What does that look like? How do we learn to live it out, that revelation? I feel like that's where Peter's at. Think about that. You and I live in this place of the already and the not yet. We live in this place, this tension of having revelation, some knowledge, some understanding of maybe who Jesus is, but then how do we live it out? What is the vehicle? What is the conduit? What is the path to be able to live that out so that you and I, because the goal is we want to be more like Jesus. That's why I'm here. That's why we're here, because we want to be more like Jesus. We want to live out what he says we can live out. We want to be like him. We want to be the hands and feet of the gospel here on the earth. We want to be little Jesuses, serving our world, showing the world what it's like to be in love with an amazing, gracious, kind, and purposeful God. So we find this emotion, this high of Peter and this low. And one part, it's like Peter gets it, and the next part is like 2 steps back. As a parent, sometimes that's how it is, isn't it? Or as a coach, or as a father, or as an employee, or as a boss. Sometimes you feel like you're going somewhere and you're getting the vision across and your parenting's going well, and then your kids make a bad decision. They take a couple steps back. And you're like, what's going on here? I thought you were getting it. Seems to me that Jesus was trying to make this connection between revelation and the aftermath. We have revelation now. How do we live it out? What does it look like? How does spiritual formation, the formation of Christ in us, how does that play out? What is the best avenue, the best path, or the best vehicle for that? So we have this revelation, we have Jesus the Christ, and we have this other side of, okay, how do we live it out? And living it out to me is, what are we doing to be mindful of the purposes of God? What are we doing to be mindful of the purposes of God? So Matthew 6:24 or 16:24, it captures the connection for me. Here's how I want to connect it. Notice there, it says, Jesus said, if anyone wants to become my follower, revelation, yes. Live it out. Be mindful of the purposes of God. Be mindful of those things. How do you do it? Jesus said there, if anyone wants to become my follower, he must deny himself. Deny himself. Deny himself. Pick up his cross and follow me daily. So in the next several weeks, we're going to be talking about disciplines for life. Here's how the revelation and living it out connects. The vehicle is what you and I practice. It's the things that you and I do in our lives in the everyday, Monday, Tuesday to Sunday lives that enables this reality of Christ to be formed in us so that we can live out and be mindful of his purposes. Transformation happens in that place. Confidence happens in that place. As you and I learn to practice certain things. As you and I learn to deny ourselves. And so we're going to talk about just practical elements of what that looks like. The practical life. There are practical things that you and I can do that we can practice. And some of them means we don't have to practice them every day, but sometimes it's just a good idea to unplug. How many know we can become so overwhelmed with the news and social media and making sure we're getting the next tweet and the next Instagram post out there that we become consumed with the likes. We become consumed with, who's going to say what, who's responding to our posts, who likes it, who hates it, who's against us. Think about all those things. And so sometimes, it's just a great idea to practice unplugging. So we'll talk about that. What does that look like? We'll talk about it in a practical sense because it becomes an important part of our rhythm, the rhythm of life. So it's something that we should practice on a consistent, regular basis. How many understand? That just sounds like a great idea, and some of you already practice that. Amen. Right? The whole monastic movement came out of this desire. How can we move away from the distractions of life? Now, there's a lot of great things wrapped up in that, and there's some other things that, become a little bit maybe extreme, and the whole point is that Jesus doesn't call us out of the world, he calls us into the world, but there's certain things that will empower us to live that out. Certain practices, right? Just like a monastic, somebody who's in a monastery would practice. So there's certain things that we can do, we can learn from those movements. We're going to talk about devotional life, the importance of prayer. The importance of Bible reading, the importance of community life. What does community life speak of? It speaks of fellowship, church. It speaks of confession, confessing our sins one to another. There's something powerful about practicing confession, right? So there's certain rhythms that you and I can incorporate that will help in this process with that. And then we'll talk about just the internal life too. There are certain things that you and I can practice. The internal life with abstaining. The Bible talks about this war of the flesh, and sometimes the flesh wins, and you and I have to learn Part of learning how to control impulses and overcome desires is sometimes abstaining. Fasting from meals. Fasting even from good things. Things that bring us pleasure. And there's some things that get in the way of relationship with God. And so what fasting does is it brings us back to that place to remind us what is the most important thing. And so if we will incorporate some of those things in our lives, what it does is it creates this groundwork for growth, for confidence, for transformation. So when I see here in chapter 16, verse 24, as I hear the words discipline written all over this. Discipline. Deny yourself, pick up your cross, follow me. You don't deny yourself without discipline. You don't carry your cross without discipline. We don't authentically follow him without what? Without living a life of discipline. So think about wherever you are right now in your relationship with God, and you might think, I'm fine. But what if you created some rhythms, incorporated some rhythms, some disciplines into your life that could take your fine life and make it extraordinary? Where you don't just think about God when things are going bad, but now you think about him when things are going really well. And you wake up and there's a song in your heart, and you go to bed and there's a song in your heart, and you're talking to a friend who's in trouble, and you're like, man, God just gave me a word of knowledge for you, and here it is. And they're like, where did that come from? How did you know? Well, I'm connected to the source. Reminds me in John chapter 6, it's there that Jesus had a few hard things to say to his disciples, and it was there that he used the words like, I am the bread of life. Whoever eats of me will not grow hungry. And it's there that Jesus sensed a need to go a little bit deeper, and he says, whoever doesn't eat of my body and drink of my blood cannot be my disciple. Obviously, he wasn't talking of physically eating his flesh and physically drinking his blood. What he was talking about is this idea of discipleship, this idea of spiritual formation, what it looks like. And it says there in John chapter 6 that many turned away and listen, they didn't want to follow Jesus anymore from that point on. Why? Because what they said is that the saying is too hard. So in essence, saying, I like the idea of being your follower, but listen, I don't want to do the work. I want the fruit. I want the benefits. But don't ask me to do anything hard. Don't ask me to eat of your body and drink of your blood. Don't ask me to sacrifice. Don't ask me to be generous with what I have. Don't ask me to think about you Monday morning. So in order to see the bigger picture, in order to see the purpose of suffering, in order to see outside the perspectives we currently have, the intentions of God, if that's going to happen, you and I are going to have to create some rhythms and some habits, create some disciplines, some space, right, for growth, for confidence and transformation. Now, if I were to ask you if you could live in this place, I think every one of us would say, that sounds great. I want to be closer to God. And when he whispers, I want to be able to hear his whisper. There's a verse my wife and I have talked about in Psalms. We know John 10 talks about the sheep and how the sheep hear the voice of God. And there's a verse in the Psalms where it talks about where God just looks that you know where to go. It's like it doesn't even have to say anything. He just looks and you're connected to the point where you can go. Think about that. What if you could be, close enough to know the heart and the mind of God and to be able to carry out his purposes? I think that's where we all want to live. But here's the reality, and if there's intensity to my speaking today and to this, don't confuse that intensity with trying to put something on you. Okay, this intensity does not come from that place. This intensity comes from a place of wanting something more for us, for me, for my life, for us. And so if there's some intensity to it, it's intensity out of that. It's intensity out of love. So I believe that to be a true statement, that you and I would want to be in that place. But here's the thing. It doesn't happen by osmosis. It doesn't happen by accident. It doesn't happen by standing to somebody, getting close enough to somebody that you look up to and just being in their presence and saying, it's going to wear off on me. Yes, there's something important about mentorship, and there's something important about being around people that you look up to. But you have to be willing to do the hard work to get to that place. So yes, we want to be in that place, and then yes, I think we have to ask ourselves, I talked about it last Sunday, gut check time. Are we willing to do the work? And again, that's not a condemning thing. And my intention is not to make anybody feel like, man, I'm not doing enough, because that's not it at all. Because if that's what you walk away with, you're not hearing the message. The intentions of God come through, they come alive through character development as we deny ourselves, as we pick up our cross, and as we live out this Jesus life. Now, when you think about, often when we read the Gospels, what we see and what comes alive is we see, for the most part, we see the last 3 years of Jesus' life. We see from age 30 to age 33. What we don't see is the 30 years where Jesus submitted to his parents, where Jesus, the Son of God, submitted to spiritual leaders over him, where he learned to submit to authority. How many know sometimes it takes some discipline to submit to those in authority over us? 30 years. He didn't just show up and say, I'm the Son of God and everybody submit to me. No, he learned what it meant to come under authority. Jesus in Luke chapter 6, verse 12, it says that he was up all night praying. Well, if we really want to live and be like Jesus, well, here's a pretty radical thought. Jesus, once in a while, not all the time, stayed up all night. Sacrifice of his time and his energy and his sleep, right, to put himself in the way of God. Now, am I suggesting that for your life right now? Not necessarily, but I'm saying there are things that he did in the preparation, in the private, that prepared him for the public. Our character is developed in the private moments, in the moments nobody sees us making the right decisions. When they can't, applaud us and say, good job, you gave today. You're a great servant. It's in those moments where we decide in our heart, because it's what we want to do, to serve God out of this way. We do those things over and over again in the private. It's the 90%, again, that lies below the surface, character. Jesus had the character. It was what happened in the private life, those 30 years that prepared him for the last 3. And sometimes we forget that, because what we see game time. And we see Jesus out there just, casting out devils and healing people and affirming people and standing up for people. What we don't always necessarily look at, though, is think about what happened in those 30 previous years. Think about Moses in the desert. Moses wasn't ready to lead the Israelites out of bondage. So he spent 30 years, or 40 years in the desert with his father-in-law, Jethro, preparing him to be a leader. See, sometimes we want to be a leader without the preparation. We want the results. We want to be the person. We want the success without the character. And you can get the success, and that's the problem in our world. Many people do get to that place, but what happens, though, if you don't have the character to support you, when the carpet's pulled out, there's nothing there to stand on. And we see it happen all the time in our world, where CEOs and people of prominence come crashing down because there's no character. Think about Jesus. It says he often got away by himself. Luke chapter 15, 16. We see that he often withdrew to lonely places. Why? Because he understood this rhythm was important for his emotional, spiritual, physical well-being. But sometimes we just got to recharge. So we create boundaries, and we have boundaries, and we set them up, and we live by them, and those things. There are no easy shortcuts. Dallas Willard, he's a pastor, writer, kind of a theologian guy. In his book, The Spirit of the Disciplines, Understanding How God Changes Lives, listen to what he says, and it's up there on the screen if you want to read it with me. But he says, it is part of the misguided and whimsical condition of humankind that we do so devoutly believe in the power of effort at the moment of action alone to accomplish what we want and completely ignore the need for character change in our lives as a whole. What is he saying? We find ourselves in trouble. What do we want? We cry out in prayer and we want God to deliver us, to give us what we need in the moment. Right? We want to have the power, we want to have the wisdom, we want to have the discernment, we want to have the miracles when we need them, when we want them. But often, what do we sacrifice? Being able to be in a place to receive them. Does that make sense? Right, where it's in our hearts, it's part of this character of who we are to behave this way. He says the general human failing is to want what is right and important, but at the same time not to commit to the kind of life that will produce the action we know to be right and the condition we want to enjoy. This is the future of human character that explains why the road to hell is paved with good intentions, that thought. We intend what is right, but avoid the life that would make it reality. Okay. So you are at what we would call a Pentecostal church. It means we believe in the power of God. We believe in the gifts of the Spirit. We believe in the miraculous. We believe in the suddenly. We believe that God is at work today, that he demonstrates himself. And here's the thing. We love the idea of God moving in the moment. Some of us, we want God to show up in our corporate worship so we can feel him and experience him. But let me ask you, are you a worshiper? Have you done the private work? Do you worship privately? Are you in a place where you're seeking him? And there's a word in the church today I think that we need to be aware of, and it's the word hunger. And you hear some people say, I'm hungry for God. Let me tell you, you don't get hungry for God without cultivating a hunger. None of us just wake up and say, I'm hungry for God. I think I'm going to go after you today. That hunger develops as we cultivate it, as we create space in our lives, as we create disciplines and space for that hunger to be cultivated. Sometimes I think, just how easy it is for our kids and others to be wrapped up in popular culture and with popular music and just all the things that are going on in our culture. Really, it doesn't take any effort. But it takes hard work to cultivate a love relationship with God. You have to work at it. Kind of have to spend some time. Might have to think differently, create some space. But here's the thing, sometimes we as Pentecostals who enjoy spontaneous moments, and they may not be so spontaneous if you really think about it. To us they are, but I think, with God, he knows what he's doing. But here's the thing. Sometimes, for us though, what we do is we hear the word discipline, and we hear the word structure, and what do? We push against it. Don't put me in a box. Don't make me feel bad for not praying today. Well, I don't think you should pray bad if you didn't. Because it's an invitation into relationship. And it's something we get to do, not something we have to do. And sometimes that's where we live in this tension that if I don't, then we put this guilt trip. I'm not putting any kind of guilt trip on anybody. Right? And we do a great job putting that on ourselves. So what I'm saying, what if we could live in a place of freedom, though, that we just create this space, and if we get to it, we do. If we don't, it's okay. I'll get to it tomorrow. But creating habits that will cultivate and be part of this relationship, this dynamic of with God. And so we can find ourselves pushing against it because it hints of legalism and structure. And yet you need to hear this. There's something good and beautiful and wonderful about creating disciplines, which is somewhat of a structure to cultivate growth. Okay. Here's what I'm not saying. I'm not saying that what we do determines our righteousness. No, Jesus, part of the problem that Jesus had, I believe, that Jesus had with the Pharisees were a religious sect, religious leaders in the culture of his day. And part of the structure problem with the Pharisees that they had set up is that they looked to the structure to be the thing that determined their righteousness, that determined their standing. When you set up structures, when you set up disciplines, when you have rhythms and habits that you follow in your life, you can't look to those things as salvation. Those things don't determine your salvation. They don't make you righteous. They don't make you spiritual in and of themselves. Because you have them doesn't mean you're that. Because you can follow every law and you can avoid everything and still be hard-hearted and angry at God and hate people. But if you look at it as this invitation into relationship, as an invitation into cultivating this hunger and this desire to know God and to have Him first so that we can be mindful of His purposes and His plans, if we look at it that way, then we see something different. So as we talk about disciplines in the coming weeks, I want you to think of that. I want you to think about something that serves as merely a path or a vehicle to deeper, intimate relationship with God. What if, because you know the voice of God, when God speaks, you're able to have confidence in His voice? What if, right, you're on the road and you're going one direction and you feel like in your heart that God wants you to do something different, you feel like you're supposed to turn around and go in a different direction, and you have confidence, even though you're supposed to be somewhere, that you do that because you trust this relationship, because you've built this rapport. You've built this confidence that can come only through practice, through relationship, through listening, being in a place to hear. What if? So what if the war inside of us is not that we push against legalism and structure? What if the real war is what's attached to what comes with the fruit, is the work? What if we don't want to sacrifice? What if we don't want to give? What if we don't want to step out and do anything more than what we're doing now? Could that maybe be where that push comes from? I don't know. I think so.